Okay, here we go. And so for those of you who are on, you should have had a pop-up that says that we are now recording for those of who couldn't join us. But we'll go ahead and get started on the presentation. And so the thing that really got me started with herbs and spices was that I took a class, a value adding class on herbs, spices, beverages and seasonings. And so it really got me thinking, wow, I think that here on island, we don't use our herbs and spices to the fullest extent. And I think there's more that we could do in order to make the most of what we are able to grow here. So
wow.
Presentation, it's just the introduction talk. We're gonna do an
Jesus Christ.
Oh. If you could please mute your microphone. Okay.
And for you to also make me a co-host and I can do muting too.
Okay, hold on just a minute. Let me do that. There we go. You should also be co-host now. So I just want to introduce, the first thing I want to do is introduce Get Local. So Get Local, GET, or Grow, Eat, and Think Local, is a program, a collaborative effort actually, through the University of Hawaii and the Cooperative Extension Service and the agents throughout the state. So we work together both in agriculture and human resources. So I would be the agriculture side, and Marielle, although she dabbles in agriculture quite a bit, she's on the human resources side. And so we just work together and utilize this particular collaborative workspace when we're doing education programs, because we really feel like it's time to get local and we really need to be focusing on local agriculture. And so the concept is just to provide opportunities for residents and even visitors who come to our island, especially those who join us in the wintertime, to learn about the origin of the local food crops, the science behind them, and also the research that's done through the University of Hawaii with our agents. So we're basically the feet on the ground, your taxpayer dollars at work, helping to determine the varieties that work best and help you problem solve with anything that's going on out in your garden or in your field. And so the goal is just to strengthen the connections between agriculture and the consumer. And so as we went through COVID, we really saw the need for food and production education, because I think we had a lot of consumers who decided they wanted to start growing their food, but they really hadn't ever had the opportunity to learn how to do that. And so I think hand in hand, the grower and the consumer working nicely with this vision of strengthening the connection encourages the consumer to buy more local food versus our imported food. Okay, so as an introduction here, move you guys over just a little bit. As an introduction here, I want to talk just a little bit about herbs and spices specifically. So they both play an important role, and we see that role in history all the way back to biblical times. In cultural aspects, especially here in our Native community, as well as in the Native American communities. Cooking, beverages, flavoring, and even medicine. I know many of you are familiar with la'au, lapa'au, but there are also other medicinal uses for herbs and spices. And by definition, an herb or a spice is a plant-derived substance. So they all come from plants, and they're just used in foods or beverages when we're preparing those, whether we're seasoning them or we're using the herbs and spices for colors. Sometimes we can even use them for preservatives, as well as we said medicine earlier. Although herbs and spices have some similar uses, they're very distinct differences as well. So we want to learn a little bit about what the difference is between our herb and our spice. And so it's really simple once you start to think about it, but herbs are considered temperate. They're herbaceous, and they are derived from the leaves of the plants. So herbs, when you talk about herbs and spices, they always will come from the leaves of the plant. The spices are considered tropical, so they grow really, really well here. They're usually from the woody plants and are made of the roots, the bark, the fruit, and parts other than the leaf. So herbs are our leaves, and spices most often are anything other than the leaves. And so you can see in the photo down here, just to give you an idea. So our berries, our flowers, our fruit that we use to flavor things or to marinate things, those are all considered spices. Cinnamon, which is the bark, that's a spice. If we use seeds like coriander seeds, those are considered a spice. And then our roots, like our turmeric and our ginger, those are also considered spices. Anybody got questions up to this point? Okay. So uses, there are a lot of uses, but the ones that we think most often of are our flavors, our dyes. So how many of you, just a raise of hands, how many of you have ever used Olena to color something? Okay. How about the aromatherapy? How many of you use essential oils? Yeah, we oftentimes use essential oils, whether it's for health reasons, to combat a cold or germs, or we also use them just for the fragrance, like lavender. It helps us relax. Medicinal, we've talked about that. We've talked about preservation. But we talked about cultural, but in many areas, the herbs and spices are used in ceremonies as well. Okay, so sensory plays a big part when we talk about herbs and spices. And so the sensory part of what we feel, we taste, we smell, we see, those things come from the essential oils. And so, oftentimes you can go out and you can buy the little bottles of essential oils. And that's really hard. If you were going to make your own essential oils, there's a process, and it's a pretty in-depth process, but it can be done. But the essential oils are determined, and those sensory effects are determined by the timing of the harvest, the way you clean, and the way you preserve any of your herbs and spices. And so all of these are very important. If you're using them as a spice or a seasoning, the spice or the herb is a seasoning, or if you're using them for the aroma, maybe in some potpourri, or if you're boiling some water just for the aromatic effects, whether you want the color or the appearance, not necessarily, when I say dyeing, not necessarily always dye. So sometimes we use things for color just to make things pop. So if you've ever bought pickles and you had, they were cucumber pickles, and they had a little bit of turmeric in there, right? What a beautiful combination. What a beautiful color combination. Also different textures that you would have there. So harvesting, cleaning, and preservation are key. So different herbs are preserved different ways. And through the next couple of months, we'll talk about all these things. But the biggest thing is harvest. And so in a minute, when we talk about harvest, one of the things that I think oftentimes we don't pay attention to, because herbs have beautiful flowers as well as leaves and the aroma. And when you have an herb garden planted, there's so many different colors and textures and patterns that sometimes we just want the beauty of growing the plant. But when you start letting the plant go, the flower form, right? It's putting all of its efforts into the flower. The plant itself will start drying out and it will start going to seed. And then the plant, most of the herb and spices that we grow, will somewhat settle back, especially the herbs, will start settling back. And if they grow in an annual pattern, they'll go ahead and pass. The whole plant will dry up and then you'll have to replant. Otherwise, if you keep the blooms cut off, you can continue to harvest and you'll continue to have that aroma and that beautiful flavoring that we taste. So when it comes to history, oh, and I just have to brag, see the ginger up at the top? That was one of our harvests this year. We had a huge harvest of ginger. We had about 4 different varieties here on island. And so I'm continuing to multiply that in hopes that next year when we have our herb and spice in-person workshop series, we can actually do some handing out of the ginger and maybe the turmeric and some of the other herbs, as well as have some taste testing. But on the history of herbs and spices, it said that they've been around since 5000 BC and before any of our fancy equipment, our grinders that we use. I like to use a coffee grinder. Of course, sometimes some herbs, you want to have different grinders for different herbs, especially if there's a lot of plastic in the machine, because you can have that carry over lingering taste or aroma. But even our infused coffees and teas, we had herbs way back before Starbucks started doing all their fancy stuff. They were revered and had value even before we had a currency system, right? They were traded. They oftentimes were traded and bartered with. They were used, we've talked about this a couple of times, trading, ceremonies, flavoring, color, and many, many more ways. Tapestry, you know, you can even take herbs and spices to coloring of tapestry way back when. So many traveled the world with herbs and spices because that was their currency. Let's take this ginger, for instance. Ginger was from China, and it ended up in spice markets all over the world. Nineveh, Babylon, and Egypt. And now you find ginger all over the world in many, many different types of markets, not only cultural markets, but also just in the average store, in the tea shop. I usually carry a piece of something that's drying out around with me, and I have it in my car, whether it's turmeric, some herbs, ginger, to let them dry. And so it's funny, every now and then I'll run into somebody and they'll say, "Hey, Jennifer, you got any ginger?" Or, "Hey, what do you have in your car today that's drying?" Because that's usually how I set it out to let it dry, so that it's protected from the moisture and from the insects and the bugs. Okay, I'm getting a connection, an unstable connection message. Can you guys still hear me and see?
You cut out for a second, but you're back now.
Okay. So selection and preparation. So there are a wide variety of spices and herbs, and just as many wide variety of spices and herbs that there are available at your lawn and garden centers. There's different ways that they need to be cared for. But usually you can get them as transplants and as seeds at the local markets or from a neighbor farmer. You want to choose a sunny location. So most all herbs and spices need sunny location. There are a couple like pepper. Pepper is an understory plant, not necessarily our chili peppers and our bell peppers and our hot peppers, but more like our black pepper and our green pepper. Like peppercorn, they actually are understory plants, as well as our cacao for the most part. You also want to think about adding compost, fertilizer. They will need nutrients from the get-go and periodically through the growing stage. But the biggest thing is to make sure that you have good organic matter in the soil, which a lot of our Molokai soils lack. So you want to make sure that you start early preparing the soil. We've actually have, let me get plugged in real quick. We actually have our herbs in pots on a table, and we actually are really enjoying growing them out in the greenhouse setting. Next year, we will be planting them in the ground in plots. One moment. have an outlet that just went out today. Okay. So back to soil preparation, whether it's the garden area, whether it's a field, or whether it is your containers, you just want to make sure that there's good drainage. Make sure that you have holes in the bottom of, you want to make sure you have holes in the bottoms of your container, and then just make sure you have enough perlite in there to help with the drainage. I like to use time release fertilizer. A lot of times all we can get here on island is Osmocote. But Marielle, is it BioFlora granules? Isn't that what you're able to get?
Yes, we have something called BioFlora crumbles, dry crumbles, which are an organic slow release fertilizer.
And so for the BioFlora, what is the analysis on that? Like the Osmocote is 14, 14, 14, which means it's 14% nitrogen, 14% phosphorus, and 14% potassium. And it's slow release, so it breaks down over a period of time. How about the BioFlora crumbles? What is the analysis?
I think it's available in a couple different formulations.
Okay.
I'll double check. I think the one we have is either 666 or like 1042 or something like that.
Okay, thank you. And so for those of you who are looking for something more organic, that is an option. I actually did find some on Amazon, but it was a very small pack that I was able to get. And I think that's about the same analysis that I was able to get. Okay, so requirements. You need to know the requirements of the particular plants that you choose. The thing with herbs, and you can see Faith here, she's actually cutting the blooms off. We were gone for an extended weekend from the farm because we were working up at the office. And so we needed to cut back the blooms, but you need to know what the requirements are, because overwatering and over fertilizing can have a major impact on your essential oils. So we get back to those characteristics, right? The flavor, the aroma, the texture, the color. And so we don't want to overwater. And that's one of the things that you're seeing here. So in this particular, we've moved some of the herbs from one table to another table. And so you see them a lighter green. And sometimes that can be nutrients, but sometimes that can be the nutrient flushing from overwatering. And so as our plants are changing and going through a different phase, as well as they've got all the flowers that will soon dry, so the plant will start changing as well. And we'll go through that in the next couple of months, and you'll see some different plants as they're changing. For the plants whose flowers are not used, so there are some flowers that are used. Chamomile, for instance, we use the flower of the chamomile. Also, if you think about it, I don't know if any of you have had passion fruit tea, but that can be made with leaves, but oftentimes it's made with the passion fruit flower. And so there are different flowers. We use lavender flowers a lot of times. And sometimes we just do bouquets of herbs. That's okay if you're not trying for leaf production. So you just kind of have to know your plant and what it takes. So make sure that if you don't use the flowers for that particular herb, that you're pinching them off as soon as you see them start to form, not when they get these long spikes. Okay. And then this will just help your plant fill in, and it'll encourage green growth. And we always say pruning encourages growth when we talk about trees. It's the same thing with herbs and other plants. So then you just want to enjoy. Once the plants are in the ground or in the container, yeah, you're going to have to fertilize them and make sure they get water, but you wait until they time to harvest, and then you enjoy the many, many options that we have for the bounty that you've harvested. Whether it's a warm cup of herbal tea or you're seasoning the catch of the day, as you see down in the bottom, just have fun with it. It's how the herbs are healthy. And if you're growing them, then they're local. So I've got two herbs that I want to focus on today to get us started. Let me see our time. Okay, we're going good. Okay, so the first is rosemary. Rosemary can be pretty finicky when you're first getting started. It's a slow grower, so a lot of people first buy the transplants versus the seed. But it's so enjoyable for me, and I think Faith would agree, and probably Marielle, it's so much more enjoyable for me to plant a seed and see it pop and see it emerge from the soil than it is just to go to the store and buy the transplant or to take a cutting. But everybody has their own preference. It can be difficult from a seed, and so our rosemary is about four months old, and it's just about this tall. Next time we'll actually have a picture of our rosemary growing out in the greenhouse, but it's slow to start, but it's doing good. The preferred method on this one is to take cuttings. And if you have a good rooting hormone that you can dip it in, it'll take a lot better for you. Just make sure that you have one that is for woody type, because this is a woody type plant for woody type plants. As far as how this particular plant grows, a lot of times we see this in the holidays, and it's shaped like a tree. They've actually, like a little Christmas tree, they've actually pruned it or topiaried it. But it's a perennial plant, so it will continue to grow more than 1 year. It usually grows 2 to 3 foot tall. It has real narrow leaves, as you can see in the photo here. The aroma of it is pretty spicy when you smell it. It can be used fresh or dried. There's a picture later on in the presentation of some rosemary bread made with rosemary. I actually use rosemary, oregano, basil, garlic, salt and pepper this weekend, making some marinara sauce for my daughter who wanted some mott sticks. They actually had some at town. And so that's the only time she'll eat rosemary, but she'll eat it in that pasta sauce or the marinara sauce that I make. Most of these, and there are different varieties of rosemary, but most of them are pretty similar in the aroma and the smell. They prefer sun, and once established, they're very drought tolerant, and they are tolerant to the salt. So they do well here. It likes well-drained soil, and as far as transplanting, it does not like to be transplanted. So when you do, if you do transplant it, just know that it's going to be finicky and it may take a while. You may want to start it in whatever size pot that you want to plant it in. But just know that you don't want to transplant it too many times. And when you do, be very careful. You want to keep the roots separated, but be very careful with the roots because they are very finicky. But once you get it established, once you get a rosemary established, it's pretty good to go for quite some time. Hey, PJ, glad you could join us. Okay, as far as the uses for rosemary, culinary, aromatherapy, stuffing or dressings, soap, oils, preservation for meat. We're starting to see it a lot more in tea. And then you can create your own. I see it in floral arrangements, in place settings. The health benefits. Rosemary is good to aid in digestion, and the oils have also been said to be used as antiseptic, and they can aid with blood pressure, low cortisol, joint pain. So you can make an oil and rub it on your joints, and then also to stimulate memory. So I'm not a doctor, and I can't say, hey, this is what you do with it, but I can say that if you read the research-based information out there, these particular things have, this rosemary has properties that help with these type things. As far as harvest and storage, you want to harvest the green leaves, and and as with most plants, especially lettuce, but your herbs too, you want to harvest early in the morning. You want to allow them to dry in a cool, dark area that's protected. If you're using them fresh, you want to put them in a plastic bag in the fridge as soon as possible so they don't wilt too bad. They can be crushed and frozen. So that's one thing about our herbs. Most herbs can't be stored for a really long period of time unless you're really, really good at preservation. So one of the ways that you can preserve something like rosemary for longer term is you can crush it and then freeze it in ice cubes and or put it in beverages, your tea, your water, something like soups, and use it later. You can store those in the freezer for up to 4 months. Okay, and so that's S is little bitty and simple preparation. So I had a recipe here for rosemary salt. And so it just takes 1 cup of rosemary leaves, 1 cup of coarse salt, and 3 cups of kosher salt. And so you blend all that together, place it on a baking sheet to dry, and then store it in an airtight container. It makes a great gift. It also goes great with a lot of the foods that we fix. And so when it comes to the nutritional value of rosemary, fresh rosemary, 1 teaspoon has, you can see here the nutritional value, and there's iron in there. So 1% iron, which was surprising to me. So herbs don't have many calories, but they can go a long way as far as adding or complementing our food and our beverages. So the next herb I want to talk about is basil. So let me go back. Sorry. Something popped up on my screen. Basil. It's one of the most well-known herbs, and there are a lot of different varieties of basil. It's so versatile, and it comes, as I said, in a lot of varieties, but different flavors, and they have different growth habits. And so this one that I have a picture of here, it's everleaf, and it actually grows in a tall column. So it's real skinny and it's real compact, where most of our basils grow like in a globe, kind of round. And so we'll get into, I hope to have you all out maybe in August to come see some of our plants, but some of them have a very spicy flavor, and some of them have a sweet flavor, like our sweet basil. We have lemon basil, which has more of a lemony smell. And then there's basil like you would just go to, so there are named varieties, but then there's basil, our common basil, which is a thinner leaf. So this one you can see is like a thicker leaf, this everleaf. The columnar, tall, skinny variety. But when you go to, let's say, Hikiola or Atlas, you go to the counter and the package just says basil. It doesn't have a named variety on it. That basil is usually kind of sweet, spicy. It's kind of in the middle, the ones that I have grown out to compare. And the leaves are a little thinner, and the flowers on those, the white flower stalks on those are a little smaller than some of these other named varieties. Propagation is really easy from seed, and it doesn't take long to grow it from seed or do tip cuttings. When you do cuttings, because basil is bad to get powdery mildew and downy mildew, you want to make sure that your plants are free of disease before you take cuttings. And if you do take cuttings, you just want to disinfect your shears after each cut with a 1 part bleach to 9 part water solution. Okay, so where our rosemary was a perennial and it would continue to grow, basil is really an annual. Sometimes you can stretch it in our conditions and get it to act kind of like a perennial, but for the most part, you're going to see the annual behavior come out. It has tender leaves, and as we said, a spicy odor and flavor. The basil generally grows about a foot to 18 inches tall. It really does like sun. It needs plenty of water, and it really likes organic matter. So the more organic matter you have in the soil, the less compact the soil is, it will really take off for you. Like I said, it can be grown here in Hawaii really well, and it can be grown year round. You just got to watch the elevation, so 700 foot and below. It grows really well in containers, and it makes a beautiful patio plant or a lanai plant, or in a table arrangement. It can be direct seeded into the garden, or it can be grown in cells and transplanted. Wait to transplant it till you see the first 2 true leaves that come out. So we have the first leaves that come out are our cotyledon leaves, and most of you have been in our gardening classes and learned about cotyledon leaves. And then the second set of leaves that come out are actually your true leaves, and that's the first leaves that actually look like the leaves that you identify the plant with. So that's on a tomato plant, that would be the first leaves that come out that actually look like a tomato plant versus a little oval or round leaf. And I talked a little bit about the growth habits. Okay, so culinary use is our main use for basil. I did talk about a little bit about decorative. I've seen it in a lot of arrangements here recently, which is really nice to see people adding things that have that natural aroma and that will last even once they're dried. So you can use it as a fresh arrangement and then let it totally dry out and it still is beautiful. We see a lot of herbal vinegars and butters, soup, salad, curry, pesto, you name it. You can use basil. Basil is wonderful in tea. As you can see here, it also has some health benefits. One of the reasons that I wanted to grow basil was for the anti-inflammatory properties. And, you know, memory. I don't know about you guys, but some days I just get so overwhelmed. And the more I go, I won't say the older I get, just the more I go, the shorter my memory gets, right? I don't think it has anything to do with age. It's all about the miles, but it helps with cholesterol. It also increases blood flow to the muscles, and it can lower blood sugar. Now, would I give up my diabetes medicine and go on basil? No, but if it's one of those things that your doctor approved, it might can work alongside of it, but that would be something you need to check with your doctor about. As far as harvest and storage, harvest the green leaves, as we said, early in the morning, because this one will wilt rather quickly. You don't want to refrigerate this because it will cause discoloration and the leaves will become unattractive, and that's really how you market it, is through the visual aspect and the aroma that comes from the leaves. So you want to take good care with that. Usually, once it's cut, people place it in a glass of water at room temperature just to keep it vibrant and lively until it's ready to go to market, or even at market if you're going to like the farmer's market. It can be crushed and again, put in the ice cubes, the ice trays, and saved for later. They can also be dried and stored. You just got to know how to dry it. Some people air dry. You got to watch your humidity. Some people dry it in a dehydrator or an oven. So I got some people trying the air fryer now to see how that does to dry it, but you just don't want to burn it up, but you want to get it dry enough that you don't have any mold, right, when you go to storage. Again, you want to pinch off the flowers as soon as you see them start to form. The minute you see that little florets start to bloom, just go ahead and pinch it off. It's a lot of work. So a lot of times, because herbs produce so many leaves, and we're talking about the herbs now, they produce so many leaves that one or two plants, especially if it's just for home use, will usually do the job. So it's not too bad keeping the blooms off of them. But when you have 10 plants, it can be a little more work once everybody gets growing and doing good. The flowers can alter the taste of the leaves. And so that's a biggie. Again, because the visual aspect and the aroma aspect are what we're looking for when it comes to basil. And then pinching the plant. Anytime you pinch the plant, even if it's harvesting the leaves, it's really encouraging the plant to get fuller and to have that rounded growth habitat, or habit instead of habitat, but more of a rounded plant, so that plant fills in the space. And then you also have the visual aspect of it, especially if it's growing in a container. So here's just a recipe that I pulled up from our family center through UH, and it's basil McNut pesto. And so you can see that it's a pretty easy recipe, but boy, with a tossed salad, whether it's pasta or veggies, man, that's some good stuff. So on the fresh basil, 5 leaves, you can see here, again, we're looking at some iron, 1% iron, not a lot of calories. You don't have to worry about the carbs, the sugar, the fat, and it's a great way to spice things up. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We'll come back to this slide, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask if there are any questions. Well, Marielle, thank you so much for keeping up with the chat. I really, really appreciate that. So I'm going to turn it over to Marielle. And for those of you who joined us late, Marielle is actually over on the Big Island, and she is a counterpart of mine. We work on several different projects together, several different teams, and one of them is the statewide seed saving initiative. And so we were talking one day, and we got to talking about herbs, and she's like, oh, I really like to grow herbs as well. And so I said, hey, you know, what if we have a good conversation about this? And she's like, hey, you know, I'll do a demo. So we've invited her today to join us, and she's going to do a demonstration for us.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was really informative. So what I'm going to be doing today is something really fast and easy, which is making herb butter, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's just softened butter mixed with herbs. So it's a great way to preserve your herbs that you're growing at home for later use, especially if they're the kind of herbs that tend to lose their flavor or texture when you dry them, like rosemary. Herbs that are great for this method are rosemary, thyme, parsley, chives, tarragon, sage, cilantro are all great options for making herb butter. It's nice because herb butter is really versatile in its use and also in the ingredients. So you can kind of adjust it to your taste or with whatever herbs you happen to have on hand. So whether they're things you're growing at home, or if you happen to have some leftover herbs in your fridge that you don't want to go to waste, this is a really nice way to use them up. So we're going to start off by doing a rosemary, thyme, and garlic butter, which I made, and what I loved it on was putting it on top of steak after it's finished cooking to add that nice herby flavor after you just cook it, you know, in a cast iron or something like that. I also have used it to saute some frozen peas with a little chicken broth, and it added, again, that really fresh flavor as if the herbs were just harvested simply by adding a dollop of this herb butter to frozen peas that I was cooking. So herb butter can be used in a lot of different ways. We talked about putting it on top of meat. You can put it on top of seafood, vegetables, scrambled eggs. You can use it to make garlic bread, put it on mashed potatoes or corn on the cob. You can throw it into pasta sauce, or even melt and drizzle it over popcorn. So it has a lot of different ways you can use it. I think once you have a little bit in your fridge or your freezer, you're going to be thinking of all sorts of interesting ways to incorporate it into your cooking without having to go through the process of harvesting, washing, chopping up your herbs every time. Or, you know, if you don't happen to have any in your garden at the moment, this is a nice way to make sure you always have something on hand in your fridge or your freezer. So I'm about to show you how easy this is. So can you guys hear me okay? Hopefully, okay, great. So what I have here are the ingredients for the rosemary, thyme, garlic butter. Very simple. This recipe uses about 1 stick of butter, which is a 1/2 cup. So I have my butter here. I have about one sort of 6-inch stem usually of rosemary is enough to make about 1 teaspoon of rosemary for this recipe. And then I would have probably a few, 3 or 4 of this size sort of twigs of thyme to make a teaspoon of thyme. And then you can also add in 2 or 3 different, 2 or 3 garlic cloves. And I'm going to be putting those through my garlic press because it sort of turns them into a paste, which makes it really easy to mix it in with the butter. So the steps are very easy. First, you're going to harvest your herbs according to some of the things that we were hearing about from Jennifer. You want to make sure you're harvesting them at the right time to get that peak flavor. For rosemary, it's going to be best to use newer growth because it's going to be softer than the older woody growth. Of course, anytime you're working with food, you want to make sure you start by washing your hands with soap and water for 20 seconds. I have to say that because I'm the food safety person. So the 2 most important steps for making herb butter are first to soften your butter. The easiest way to do that is to just leave it out for a few hours on the countertop. So I just put mine out in the wrapper, and then once it was soft, I put it in this container. If you forget to leave it out, you can soften it in the microwave with the power only at 10%, so it doesn't totally melt. Another method I haven't tried, but you can microwave a mug of water to get your microwave all steamy and then put the butter in there to sit in the steam and soften up. What you're looking for is butter that is easy to stir. You see how easily that kind of smushes down? So that'll make it really easy to mix in our herbs. Now, the other thing that we need to do is to make sure that we have our washed and dried finely chopped herbs. So to make herb butter, you really need to have dry herbs. So the best thing to do is to harvest them a few hours before you're going to make your herb butter, dry them off with a paper towel, and then sit them on the paper towel so they can dry out completely. We don't want any extra moisture on your fresh herbs because we're putting it in the butter. We don't want any like little drops of moisture stuck in there. We also are finely chopping them, as you can see, and so it's easier to chop them really finely when they're nice and dried, but still fresh. So I wanted to take a second here to talk about actually the best ways to get the leaves off your stems, because if you start with this, you might just start pulling the leaves off or that sort of thing. There are a few ways you can sort of speed that process along. One trick is to run your thumb and forefinger in the opposite direction of the growth down the stem, just like that, and that will pull all the leaves off. That won't work for like the tips, but you can pinch the tips off. Another really cool trick that I learned just the other day is using a colander and pulling your herbs through a hole in the colander. So for this, I would just take probably 1 stem at a time because otherwise it'll probably get stuck. So I'm going to pull off a couple stems of the time here. And I'm just going to stick it through one of the holes of the colander and pull it through. And as you can see, it's just pulling off all of the green leaves from the stem of the thyme. So especially if you're going to be doing a lot of herb butter or cooking with a lot of herbs, sometimes that could save you a little bit of time. So that's just a cool trick to try. So like I said, today we're just going to be doing one stick, a half a cup of butter, but you can make these in big batches. If you choose to do it that way, you might want to use a food processor where that would chop up your herbs first and then you put in the butter. Or you can use a mixer, but I just like to do small batches. So that's what we're going to be doing here today. So I've got my softened butter, and then I'm going to be adding a teaspoon of finely chopped rosemary, a teaspoon of finely chopped thyme, and then I'll be adding that garlic. So pretty easy. Let's see. End up with a teaspoon there. See this? Toss that in. Teaspoon of our finely chopped rosemary. You can see why you wouldn't want some big chunks of rosemary leaves in this, because that would be a little overpowering and the texture wouldn't be as good. Next, just going to press my garlic. If you guys haven't used a garlic press, it's pretty amazing. Scrape that off. So that's about 2 cloves of garlic. And now I'm just going to mix this up until it's evenly mixed. So you can use a fork. Like I said, if you're making big batches, you might choose to do this a different method. But this one I think is the easiest cleanup. That's what I'm all about. Actually, a spoon probably isn't as good a tool for this as a fork would be, but we're going to make sure that's all evenly mixed. Oh man, I wish you could smell this. It's just, especially with the garlic in there, it just smells so incredible and herbaceous. So this is salted butter. If you have unsalted butter when you're making herb butter, I would really recommend adding salt to your taste. If you are watching your sodium intake, it would probably be better to add salt yourself so that you can control the amount you have. A lot of folks like to add garlic to their herb butters. You can also add shallots is another option that people like to do. So the last step of making herb butter is the storage process. So you can just, make this look pretty, smooth it out, stick an airtight lid on it, and put it in your fridge. And that'll last for maybe 4 or 5 days. If you're planning on using it for a bunch of meals, that would be fine. But one of the great things about herb butter is that you can freeze it for later use. And you can either freeze it directly in that container, but that means you have to thaw the whole thing out whenever you want to use it. So what you can do instead is freeze it into this neat little log. And then you can actually just cut off little slices of it as you need it. And so you could keep it in this whole roll frozen, but that's going to be pretty hard to cut. What you might want to do is, after you make it into your little roll here, stick it in the fridge so it firms up. And then you could actually pre-cut it into slices and then put it into a freezer safe container and freeze that, because then you have little frozen portions of herb butter that you can just pop out like an ice cube and throw into whatever dish you're making to add that fresh herb flavor any time of year really easily without having to go through the process of harvesting or buying your herbs. So I'm going to show you how to do that little herb log. It's really fun and easy. You just use some wax paper because that is the best thing for the butter not to stick. And what we're going to do is try and spread out an even size or an even width portion along here. And next we're going to try and roll that into a log. So I'm going to fold my wax paper over so my 2 edges are sort of touching like this. And the trick I just saw online is you take anything with a flat edge, so like a muffin tin, or this is a bread pan, and you press along that seam, and it makes it into this really beautiful little log shape. And so from there, you can roll it up the rest of the way. If you want to freeze it, what I would do is, like I said, roll it up the rest of the way. You can kind of twist off the ends here to secure it. The best way to do it if you wanted to serve it straight from the freezer would be to stick that in the fridge. When it's firm, cut it into those little medallions and then put it in a freezer safe container. So you have those single portions. You could also just freeze the whole thing, but butter does absorb a lot of flavors and odors wherever it is. So it's best to put it in like an airtight container or parchment paper rather than freezing it directly in this wax paper. So what I'm going to do with mine is I'm just going to put it in the fridge in a Ziploc until it's firm, and then I'll cut it up into some pieces and freeze it. So what do you think, Jennifer? Do we have time for one more quick herb butter?
I think that we have hit our 1 o'clock, but I think that if anybody can stay on and wants to stay on, I think let's go for it.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I think that's the basics of making an herb butter. So feel free to take it and run with it. You can find a lot of different recipes available online that will use whatever you happen to have. You could make a sage or a shallot and thyme herb butter, a basil one. So there's a lot of options. So the one that I'm going to show you right now is a chive and horseradish one that I think would go really well on meat or actually on mashed potatoes. So for this one, it's just 1 stick, half a cup of softened salted butter. I'm going to add 2 to 3 tablespoons of finely chopped chives. So this actually was a pretty decent sized little handful of chives that I had to harvest for this recipe. 2 to 3 tablespoons is quite a bit. But this is great because, yeah, chives don't, they're going to lose a lot of their flavor and their texture and their smell if you were to just dry them. And then we just add 1 tablespoon of horseradish. I don't know about you, but I love horseradish. So I might even go a little further with that. And then we'll mash it all together and you can see how the fork actually is a really good tool for this. Get that all together. So again, this is all going to be really versatile. So whatever herbs you have in your garden, I would encourage you to look up some different recipes for some different potential combinations that you might want to try. They're going to go better with different things depending on what's in it. But you can also adjust it to your taste. So if I taste this after I mix it all together and I think, ooh, I want a little more horseradish, I can definitely do that. Or if I think, you know what, this could really use more chives or something like that. Or maybe I will throw in some shallots, something like that. Another thing that folks sometimes add to their herb butter is lemon zest, which can add a whole nother dimension to it as well. So there you go. Pretty simple. All you have to worry about is softening your butter, washing, drying, and chopping those herbs, mixing it all together, and then storing it. All right.
So
I'm just gonna pop a
Marielle,
lid on this.
I have a question. How do you dry your herbs? What's your favorite method?
For making the herb butter or drying them down completely?
For making the herb butter.
I just wash them when I've set out the butter. So usually like 3 or 4 hours before I'm going to make the butter. And then I pat them dry lightly with a paper towel. And I live in a really dry area, so I just leave them on a dry paper towel on the counter and let it get dried a little bit more. Maybe dab it a few more times with that paper towel before actually chopping it up. but that usually is enough for when I've made it. I've never had any problems. But if you were in a really moist environment, you might have to depend a little bit more on some paper towels and that sort of thing to make sure they're nice and dry. But again, I think it's partly for ease of chopping it up and then just making sure you don't end up with too much moisture. You don't have to dry it down a ton so it gets crispy or anything. You want to really maintain that freshness. So yeah, we had a great comment here in the chat about, can you use cream cheese as well? I have never tried that, but I bet that would be a great option. You could probably do that as well. I don't know. I've never tried freezing cream cheese. You probably could. I would like to try it with cream cheese and chives. That would probably be a great.
Sounds good.
Yeah, so you probably use the same process of just leaving out your cream cheese for a little bit so it gets soft and mixing it in with whatever herbs you want to try. That would be great spread on a bagel.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I am gonna put in my text number in the chat, and this is Jennifer Hawkins. Okay, so I want to encourage you guys to make something this week, and send me a photo of it and what you made, and we'll share it in our next presentation. Whatever I get, we'll share in the next presentation next month. I think that'll be fun for everybody to see what came out of this. Marielle, thank you.
I think, yeah, I have to say, I had never made herb butter before I started preparing this demo. And now I'm just like, I think I'm totally sold on it. It's really easy. Like, it turned frozen peas into an incredible dish. My baby loved it, ate the peas like crazy. She was really into it. And it was so much easier than having to like go chop up herbs and then throw them in and wait till they get soft and that sort of thing. So it's really cool.
Cool. Well, I hope that you guys will join us again. I believe probably the third week of the month, we'll try to do herbs. Next Tuesday, we're going to do intro to seed saving. And Glenn Tevis will be with us, and we'll do a demonstration on saving some seeds, and hopefully then during the week before we have our second workshop, you guys can try your hand at saving some of the seeds. So we're super excited about being able to do some of these hands-on demonstrations, even though they're not in person, but utilizing the resources that we've all discovered during COVID, right? I think some of these things we had out there, but we didn't take the time to use them. And so I'm really excited about the opportunities that we have. So thank you all for joining us. And let me also give you my email. And if you want to email me and you want to get on my email list or my mailing list, or you just want to sign up for the next workshop so that you get those updates regularly, just send me an email. Let me know what you're interested in. I know August, we're going to do a focus on seed saving. September, we'll do soil health. But like I said, at least once a month, we'll also be doing the herbs because we want to continue that through the growth cycle so that you guys can see some of the herbs that we've got growing out here. Any questions? Okay, well, if there are none, I want to thank you guys for joining us, and I want to do an extra special thank you and mahalo to Marielle for joining us all the way from Big Island. Thank you, Marielle.
Yeah, thanks. It was a lot of fun. Great ideas, you guys.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your week, everybody.